Now, Dan, COVID obviously made life difficult for commercial tenants. Lockdowns have made it hard for businesses to meet their obligations, including rent, since they weren't even able to operate a business for many months. So there have been
Mhm,
tenants who sought relief from the courts and they sought relief from their lease obligations. And you've written about
mhm,
one especially interesting case from British Columbia, Cherry Lane Shopping Center in Hudson's Bay, where the
mhm.
Bay had failed to pay their landlord. So what can you tell me about that case, what the Bay was saying, what their landlord was saying, and what the court ultimately decided?
Yeah, so I mean that is true. Commercial tenants have had a very rough go at it since COVID started. And in my practice, what I see is they're the class of client that I deal with who are suffering the most through listening and have been because lockdowns and other measures, they can't operate their businesses. The first thing that comes due is rent. And what they're arguing, and this is true, is these are circumstances outside of our control. I mean, it's not our fault. There's a pandemic. We can't even open for business. You got to help us. There's something you have to do for us. And unfortunately for them, courts have not favored them because there's nothing in their leases that says they could get out of paying rent. And that's become a problem. And in this case, an interesting argument was raised on the COVID side that the Bay was saying that we operate in a shopping center and the landlord has a positive obligation to operate it in a first class manner, to market more aggressively during the pandemic, to take measures to make sure health measures are instituted to help drive business because we're renting in your space. You have that obligation. So, and because of that, they're saying because you're not doing that, we should be relieved from paying rent until you start pulling your weight as well. So they brought that to the attention of the court over there, and the judge, not unpredictably, said, "Well, this is not really an issue when it comes to the payment of rent. That even if this is true, it doesn't excuse you. It doesn't get you out of paying rent." So tenants' hands were tied, and this is just one of many arguments that have been raised in this case, and they have not been successful in doing this. And it's difficult for a lot of us. I mean, I get calls all the time from tenants saying like, there has to be something you can do for me. I mean, I can't operate my business. Can't the courts lend a hand at all? And unfortunately for them, the answer is no, because these contracts, which they signed before this pandemic, don't excuse them from their obligation.
Now, Karima, the Bay is a huge business, and they still struggled with their obligations. So, how has the pandemic impacted smaller commercial businesses and their ability to meet their lease obligations?
As you can imagine, I think smaller businesses have been even more drastically impacted
Mhm.
because they don't necessarily have a large reserve of funds to draw from. In many cases, it's uh, operating on a month to month basis and hoping to stay afloat in that way. So the pandemic really put a damper in those efforts, and anecdotally, I see many small businesses in my neighborhood, and when I leave my neighborhood, that have closed.
Karima, just briefly, I know that the government has created some relief programs for commercial tenants during the pandemic. What can you tell me about that commercial lease program and how it's working?
The government has implemented a few relief measures. There was a moratorium on evictions that ran throughout 2020, and there was the emergency commercial rent assistance program, which put the onus on landlords to apply, and landlords essentially were given this forgivable loan. So if a tenant had a landlord who wasn't really interested in that process, they weren't able to access that relief. So I think that's been one of the main criticisms. But for individuals and parties who were able to access that, it was probably a lifesaver.
Dan, briefly, your thoughts on that program, the Emergency Commercial Rent Assistance Program.
Yeah, I mean, what Karima just said was spot on, and it happened all the time. That we had clients who were calling us saying our landlord's not opting in. I mean, the principle was the landlord had to take a 25% haircut on its rent. The government kicked in 50, and the tenant would pay the additional 25. Everyone would share in the pain. But if landlords didn't opt in, tenants were facing problems. And then a new program assisted it, and it came with its own problems there.